The streets are in flames. Smoke curls above shattered rooftops as the sound of steel on steel fades into the cries of the defeated. The warriors who once defended the city lie lifeless, their blood soaking into the stones. And while the conquerors celebrate their victory, another horror begins. Doors are kicked open. Families torn apart. Women dragged from their homes, their screams echoing through alleys that only hours before were filled with ordinary life. Children clutch at their mothers, ripped away by hands that see them not as people, but as spoils. The world remembers the Ottomans as brilliant tacticians, mighty builders of an empire stretching across continents. But there is a part of their story rarely spoken of, a cruelty so devastating that even death itself might have been kinder. What happened to the wives of the defeated warriors? What was their fate after their husbands fell? Death would have been swift, merciful. Instead, the Ottomans had something far worse planned. A fate that lingered in silence, humiliation, and chains. A punishment not aimed at the warriors who fought, but at the women who bore their names and carried their bloodlines. And before this story ends, you will hear the darkest revelation, what the Ottomans truly did behind palace walls, away from the eyes of history. The Ottoman Empire did not rise overnight. It began as a small frontier state at the edge of Anatolia, but through fire, steel, and relentless ambition, it grew into one of the most feared powers in human history. From the 14th century onward, city after city fell under the Crescent banner. Constantinople itself, once thought untouchable, crumbled in 1453 and became the proud capital of a new empire. But the Ottomans were not remembered only for their victories. They were remembered for what they did after the battles ended. The sword was their weapon, but so was fear. They understood that controlling land was never enough. To truly rule, they needed to break the spirit of entire peoples. And that meant reaching into homes, into families, and into the very bloodlines of their enemies. At the center of this world was the Sultan, absolute ruler, believed to hold power by divine will. His word decided the fate of thousands, and his palace became a world of shadows, where politics mixed with desire, and cruelty often wore the mask of elegance. Surrounding him was the harem, not merely a place of pleasure as many imagine, but a calculated machine of political control. The women inside were not all willing courtesans. Many were captives, seized from conquered lands, their beauty and bloodlines repurposed to strengthen Ottoman rule. Then there were the janissaries, the Sultan's elite soldiers, forged from boys torn from their families through the devshirme system. They became loyal only to him, raised to kill the very people they had once called their kin. The Ottomans believed that by separating men, women, and children, by severing every tie of identity, they could reshape conquered nations into obedient subjects. Victory did not end on the battlefield. For the Ottomans, the true conquest continued inside the palaces and the chambers of the harem. Wives of fallen warriors, princesses of defeated kingdoms, even the daughters of noblemen, all could be forced into silence, stripped of name and heritage, reshaped into property of the empire. This was domination on a scale that reached far beyond death. It was not enough for an enemy to be defeated. His memory had to be erased. His wife, his children, his bloodline, absorbed, broken, or silenced forever. And yet, what happened behind those palace walls was far darker than the stories most historians are willing to tell. The wars of the Ottoman Empire were never confined to battlefields. When the clash of steel ended, another war began, a war fought in the homes of the conquered. In city after city, the wives and daughters of fallen warriors were taken as spoils. They were paraded, not always into slavery markets, but into harems, palaces of silken curtains and gilded halls that hid the weight of iron chains. These women became bargaining chips, political pawns offered to appease sultans, officials, and loyal soldiers. Some were noblewomen who had once ruled beside their husbands. Within hours, they were stripped of their names, given new titles in Turkish, and forced to bend before the same power that had slaughtered their families. Many were compelled to abandon their faith. Conversion was not offered as a choice, it was demanded as survival. Imagine a woman standing inside a great chamber, priests and imams surrounding her, her old faith mocked as a relic, while her new life was written in words she could not refuse. To embrace Islam meant abandoning her lineage. To resist meant punishment, isolation, or death. This was not merely the loss of religion. It was the loss of memory. Generations of identity served with a single word spoken under duress. And while the women bore this silent fate, their sons faced something equally cruel. The Devshirme system is often remembered as a method of creating elite Janissary soldiers. Boys were taken from Christian families, converted, trained, and molded into the empire's most loyal warriors. But what is less spoken of is how the Ottomans mirrored this practice with women. Just as boys became weapons, women became hostages. Both were designed to erase the bloodlines of conquered peoples, to turn them into tools for the empire. The streets of a defeated city told the story better than any chronicle. A father executed, his son dragged away in chains, his wife pulled screaming toward the palace gates. The silence afterward was deafening. Families who had once stood proud were reduced to whispers, their very names disappearing from records. And the soldiers of the fallen knew this was worse than their own deaths. For death at least ended the pain. For their wives and children, the torment was only beginning. But this was only the surface. These scattered stories, as horrific as they are, pale in comparison to what awaited behind the closed doors of the Ottoman palaces. There, cruelty was not random. It was institutionalized, systematic, and carefully designed to humiliate entire bloodlines. The true horror of Ottoman conquest was not the clashing of swords, nor the bodies left to rot on battlefields. It was what happened afterward, in silence, behind palace walls. For the wives of defeated warriors, death was not their end. Their fate was enslavement, systematic, deliberate, and calculated to erase entire bloodlines from history. When a city fell, women of rank were not left to mourn in their shattered homes. They were rounded up, separated from common captives, and escorted under guard to the imperial court. Some were marched for days across hostile lands, their former titles reduced to whispers, their presence a spectacle for the victors. In the eyes of the Ottomans, they were living symbols of conquest, proof that no warrior, no matter how noble, could protect his household from the empire's reach. The transformation began immediately. Ritual humiliation stripped noblewomen of their identity. Their names were replaced with new Turkish or Arabic ones. Their religions were discarded in forced conversion ceremonies where refusal was impossible. Queens and princesses who once commanded respect were dressed not in royal silks of their homeland, but in garments chosen for them by their captors. Inside the harem, hierarchy was ruthless. A woman could be paraded as a concubine or gifted to a loyal Ottoman officer as property. The message was clear: the wife of a warrior was no longer a wife, no longer a queen, no longer even herself. She was a spoil of war. This breaking of status was not random cruelty, it was policy, a weapon designed to sever dynasties and absorb their power into the empire. The greatest cruelty lay not only in humiliation but in legacy. Many of these women bore children for their captors. These children, though born of noble blood, were raised as Ottomans. They were cut off from their father's name, his kingdom, his heritage. Lineages that had lasted for centuries vanished within a generation, replaced by bloodlines tied to the empire. Imagine a princess, daughter of a king, carrying the child of the very man who had ordered her father's execution. That child would never know his true ancestry. His mother's past would be silenced. And the dynasty of his grandfather, obliterated, absorbed into Ottoman history as if it had never existed. Historians often glorify the Ottoman Empire, praising its architecture, its military brilliance, its cultural achievements. But what if that grandeur was built not just on conquest, but on cruelty? What if the marble palaces, the glittering mosques, and the libraries of Istanbul were shadows cast by the silent suffering of women whose stories were deliberately buried? Behind the walls of Topkapi Palace, power was measured not only by armies but by broken bloodlines. To rule a kingdom was one form of victory. To erase it from history by erasing its women was another. And this practice was not isolated. It was institutionalized. A machine of domination that ensured no defeated warrior could ever rise again, for his wife, his children, and his dynasty were already claimed by the empire. But as shocking as this is, the truth does not end here. Because what happened to these women was not only about enslavement or lineage, it was about creating an empire built on silence, where the most brutal acts were hidden behind silken curtains, disguised as grandeur. And yet, what if this system, this cruelty, was not unique to the Ottomans? What if other empires, too, built their greatness on the suffering of women whose names have been erased? History has no shortage of cruelty toward the defeated, and the Ottomans were not alone in their methods. Across empires, the fate of captured women reveals a pattern that repeats again and again. The Mongols, for instance, swept across Asia with a fury unmatched. Entire cities were burned to the ground, and women of conquered lands were seized as rewards for generals and soldiers. Noblewomen were forced into marriages meant to cement alliances, but just as often, they were used as trophies of power. Chronicles speak of Khans taking the wives of rival rulers as their own, not only to satisfy desire but to humiliate their enemies in the most intimate way possible. For the Mongols, destroying a man's legacy meant making his wife and daughters part of their own bloodline. The Romans were no less brutal. When a general returned from conquest, his triumphal parade often included the defeated queen or princess, shackled and forced to march through the streets of Rome as a spectacle for the crowds. Once paraded, they were rarely granted freedom. Many ended in slavery, sold in markets, stripped of their past, their names reduced to a line in a ledger. These women symbolized victory, living reminders that Rome ruled not only with the sword but with the degradation of its enemies. The Crusaders, too, left scars across the lands they invaded. Women were taken as war prizes, often shared among soldiers or offered to commanders. Chroniclers speak of noblewomen carried away from their families, their identities consumed by the chaos of conquest. For many, captivity was worse than death, for it was unending, shame-ridden, and designed to erase every trace of their lineage. But the Ottomans took these practices and perfected them. Where the Mongols relied on brute force and the Romans on spectacle, the Ottomans institutionalized the process. Their palaces and harems were not merely places of decadence, but engines of power. By systematically absorbing the wives and daughters of defeated warriors into their empire, they ensured that no dynasty could rise again. Bloodlines were rewritten, legacies erased, and entire peoples subdued without another sword being lifted. And yet, some historians romanticize the harem. They describe luxury, silken cushions, fountains, poetry, music. They speak of women who wielded influence behind the scenes. But what they often fail to acknowledge is the chain that brought these women there. Luxury is meaningless when it begins with conquest, when it begins with the burning of your home, the death of your husband, and your forced entry into a palace where your life is no longer your own. The truth is not in the silks or the fountains. It is in the silence of those who never spoke again of who they were, because history stripped their names away. And as we peel back these layers, we approach the darkest revelation of all, the secret hidden at the heart of Ottoman conquest. A secret so devastating, that even death itself may seem merciful in comparison. This is where the cruelty reached its peak. For the wives of defeated warriors, enslavement was only the beginning. The true horror lay in what came next. These women, once wives, queens, and daughters of powerful men, were not only forced into submission, they were forced into motherhood under their conquerors. The Ottoman rulers understood that children carried bloodlines, and by making the women of their enemies bear children, they rewrote history itself. A dynasty that had stood for centuries could vanish in a single generation, its heirs replaced by children born of conquest. Picture it, a queen who once ruled beside her husband, now reduced to a concubine in a gilded prison, her body no longer her own. When she bore a child, that child was not her husband's legacy, it was the empire's. The line of kings who had defended their people ended with her silence, erased as if it had never existed. The Ottomans did not simply defeat warriors. They buried dynasties by turning their wives into instruments of empire building. The humanity of these women makes the story unbearable. Mothers were separated from their older children, forced to abandon them to fate while carrying the child of their captor. Daughters were raised to forget their fathers' names, their noble heritage replaced with Ottoman identity. The pain was not only physical, it was spiritual, generational. Some of these women lived in luxury, surrounded by silks, jewels, and music. But behind the beauty was a silence deeper than death. To walk through a palace where every ornament glitters while knowing your soul has been stolen is a torment no treasure could erase. And so we must ask the question that lingers like a shadow across the centuries: was this worse than death? To be stripped of your name, your faith, your dignity, and then to carry the bloodline of the very men who slaughtered your people. History tells us of empires built on conquest. But what if the truest foundation of Ottoman power was not its armies or its cannons, but the wombs of the women they enslaved? This is the darkest truth. A legacy of silence that still haunts the ruins of palaces and the pages of forgotten chronicles. And it forces us to confront a chilling reality, that the glory of an empire may have been born from the greatest humiliation of its captives. We began with the question, what did the Ottomans do to the wives of defeated warriors? And the answer is as chilling as history allows. It was worse than death. It was a living captivity, a carefully crafted system designed to erase their existence, their faith, their names, and their bloodlines. Empires are remembered for their victories, their conquests, their golden ages. But should they not also be remembered for the silent screams of those who never held a sword? For the women whose bodies became battlegrounds, whose lives were rewritten not with ink but with chains? And so I leave you with this question: do you see this as strategy, or cruelty? Was this the genius of empire building, or was it the darkest form of domination the world has ever known? Comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. If this story shook you, the next one will disturb you even more, when rulers turned this same cruelty, not on their enemies, but on their own families. Subscribe, and don't miss it.